Title your notes, Gilded Age Part 2. Now, we left off talking about the new newspapers. We talked about yellow journalism. We talked about where yellow journalism, or the yellow press, got its name. It's from this character right here called the Yellow Kid from the comic Hogan's Alley. We talked about the different sections in the newspapers. We talked about how the newspapers were set up to grab headlines and to get people to buy them. That's what yellow journalism is. It's sensationalism. It's trying to get people basically to purchase your paper. So keep that in mind as we go through this. I mean, that's probably one of the most important points that we can send with you is what yellow journalism is all about, especially for this time period, because it will have a lot of influence over our country, even start a war, as we're going to see. The next guy we'll talk about is William Randolph Hearst. He will actually be known as the king of the yellow press. Pulitzer was the father of the yellow press. Hearst will be the king. He will buy the newspaper industry from Pulitzer. Pulitzer was getting ill. We talked about how he was nearly blind at this point, at this stage. So William Hearst is going to take this yellow journalism, the yellow press, to a new level. And down the road will actually be one of the causes of the Spanish-American War. So we'll continue to talk about him, and we'll add to him his background later. Now, the bottom line is the U.S. is growing very fast. Society is changing at a tremendous, tremendous rate. And things are moving very fast. Frankly, the U.S. is having a hard time keeping up with all these changes. And we'll see that. For some people, things are really good. Okay, for the rich, things are unbelievably good. We're seeing a new power elite emerge. About 400 families have emerged as the power elite of the United States. However, there is polarization. Polarization is where two things move in different directions. So the old adage, as the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. We see this as well. Okay, the poor, especially the immigrants that are coming over to America at this point, are really feeling the effects of not having any money in this society, and frankly, some are taken advantage of. We talked about the political machines. We talked about jobs and things like that. So as things are getting better for some, they're getting worse for others. Okay, the slums. Now imagine the worst living conditions you could possibly imagine. We can't, hopefully we cannot relate to this. We have indoor plumbing. Imagine living in a city where there is no indoor plumbing. People are taking their waste, whether it's trash or human waste, and taking it to the curbs. The old, there's a, for you guys out there, when you go on a date and you're walking down the street, it's tradition that the man should be closer to the street than the woman. This actually comes from this time period, because as carriages and things went by, sometimes some water or whatever would get splashed up onto the curb. Well, it's not just water, folks. And that's why the men would traditionally walk closer to the street to kind of protect their ladies from that aspect. The idea of gutters and things, that was basically to divert the water and the waste away from just running off the edge of a building. You know, there was no indoor plumbing. People were used to, in the farms, you go out to the outhouse. We don't have outhouses in the city. You'd have a bunch of them outside. But a lot of times people didn't do that, especially at night. You would have a thing called chamber pots, where they would do what they had to do in those chamber pots and then take them out to the street and dump them, or just dump them out the side of the window too. Most of the poor were immigrants during this time period, and most of them were living in these slums. A lot of them were slums that they lived with people of their same ethnicity in those small jam places. Very common to have 4, 5, 6, 10 people living in a very small one-bedroom apartment. There were tenements that people lived in. It might be a 4 or 5-story building with 20 families stuck in there. And people's beds, for instance, little children, their room may be a closet. A baby may be sleeping in a drawer. That's how things were done. And later on, we'll show you some pictures of some of this. Not only that, but wild animals running the streets, rats, other critters, pigs, wild packs of dogs. They were actually dangerous during this time period. There wasn't any of these things going on. Like I said, sanitation, restrictions, legislation to protect the people from this stuff, that wasn't even thought of yet. And you can just imagine how nasty some of these places are. So just incredible the amount of disease and things that spread during this time period as well. Now for the wealthy, we're going to see more and more time for recreation. This is where my favorite sport, baseball, gets its start and really explodes during this time, becomes the nation's pastime. We see really it goes back to the 1840s. There was a team called the New York Gentlemen and the New York Knickerbockers. They would play very similar game to what we call baseball today. They called it rounders. But they would get together twice a week. We'll start to see our first professional baseball team. Anybody know the name of the first professional baseball team? The Cincinnati Red Stockings. The Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869 were the first players to be paid for playing. We'll see it expand from there. The American Association, the first catcher's mitt in 1882. The National League will be formed in the 70s. We'll start to see venues. Instead of taking the game to people started going to the games. I love this picture down here. And any baseball fan, look how close these people are sitting to the action. And in the background, that's the outfield wall. That is the stands. If you guys have ever been to the Reds Hall of Fame, you will see some of the old pictures at Crosley, and there's another place called the Palace of the Fans, where the fans were actually on the field. So much different than today. Here's a picture of the Polo Grounds. This is in New York. No longer there. This was built by a man named Stanford White. Stanford White. And you can see the old triple-decker. This is more of a modern-day baseball park. Pretty neat. So here's a picture of, that's Madison Square Garden. Okay. Stanford White built this as well to host social events. And it could be, we know Madison Square Garden today for the Knicks and the New York Rangers, the hockey team, but it's also hosts many other things, and especially back then, even horse shows. People would buy these things, buy tickets to these events, and people started going to these events. Stanford White actually lived up here in this tower. He had an apartment, threw some crazy parties. His parties were legendary. Women jumping out of cakes and things like that. There he is. Check out that mustache. Hey-yo. Extra credit for anybody that can grow that thing. Some other things. Bicycling became one of the nation's favorite pastimes. 1 million people were bicycling in 1893. It's not going to last long because a thing called the car comes along and kind of ruins bicycling. But it was very common for people to ride their bikes. There was a famous stage star at that time named Lillian Russell. Her nickname was Busty. She actually had a gold-plated, jewel-studded bike that she kept in a leather case. So she had a gold bedazzled bike that she rode around very proudly during that time. By 1900, the fad ends. But as we know, we all had bikes when we were little because that's how we got around. Once you guys are able to drive, those bikes kind of fall to the wayside. I'll show you a picture of Busty Russell here shortly. Beaches became more popular during this time. Basically, we had this recreational time because, especially for the wealthy, and we're seeing an emerging middle class, people have time for recreation and money. Okay, people started flocking to the beach. Coney Island opened. The women's bathing suit was becoming more popular, much different than our bathing suits today. At some point, some of the bathing suits were made out of like 10 yards of cloth, so a little less revealing than today's bathing suits. Amusement parks, okay, like Coney Island, or in our words, Kings Island or Cedar Point. They were actually built in the suburbs of these major big towns because the trolley car companies would build these things, and they would the whole point of that was to get you to get on the trolley cars. Now women became to play a bigger role too, and we'll see more and more women will become interested in political movements too. We know that the women's suffrage act has been moving toward letting women to vote, and that's been happening for quite some time. But along with that came what's called the temperance movement. The temperance movement was an anti-booze movement. There's Lillian Russell, by the way. She's a woman with the gold-plated bike. Well, the temperance movement was basically led by this woman named Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was a beautiful woman. Here is her picture. Ah! Wow. She walked in to bars carrying a Bible and a hatchet. She would read scripture from the Bible as she smashed the whiskey and beer barrels with her hatchet. She was arrested many times, and she would actually sell souvenir hatchets to pay for her bail or her fines or whatever she had to do. But that's what her crusade was, is to stop people from drinking. And you could see, if she walked into a bar, is anybody going to go up to talk to her? She was 6'8", 400. No, I'm just kidding. But obviously a very strong and powerful movement, because as we know, in the 20s this will build up and they'll actually ban alcohol altogether. So she was the leader of the temperance movement early on. Her name is Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation. Okay, that is it for today. That is it for the Gay 90s. We will continue at a later date. Stay classy, Vandalia.